For 18 years, one of America's most talked about missing persons cases had no ending. Natalee Holloway was 18 years old, a graduating senior from Mountain Brook, Alabama, on a high school trip to the Caribbean island of Aruba with more than 100 classmates when she vanished on the night of May 30th, 2005. She was last seen leaving a bar in the island's capital, Oranjestad, with a young Dutch local named Joran van der Sloot and two brothers, Deepak and Sadish Kalpo. She never made it back to her hotel. Her flight home left without her the next morning. What followed was an extraordinary search effort involving the FBI, the Dutch government, cadaver dogs, sonar teams, scanning the surrounding ocean floor, and eventually one of the most intensely covered missing persons. Investigations in American media history. Her body was never found. No physical evidence was ever recovered that definitively proved what had happened to her. In 2012, 7 years after she disappeared, a court formally declared Natalee Holloway legally dead, a declaration made not because anyone had proof of what happened, but simply because enough time had passed with no sign of her at all. Joran van der Sloot became the prime suspect almost immediately, and he stayed the prime suspect for the rest of his life without ever being convicted of her murder. He was arrested and questioned multiple times by Aruban authorities in the months after Holloway's disappearance, and was released each time for lack of sufficient evidence to charge him. He gave interviews to American media, sat for at least one televised sting operation, where he appeared to describe disposing of her body to someone he didn't realize was working with investigators, and then walked that account back afterward, claiming he'd made it up for money. For years, this was the frustrating shape of the entire case. A prime suspect who talked constantly, who seemed to enjoy the attention the case brought. Him, who told multiple contradictory versions of what happened that night, but who was never formally convicted of anything connected to Natalee Holloway's disappearance, because without a body, without physical evidence, and without a confession that could be used in court, prosecutors didn't have a case that could withstand a criminal trial. Van der Sloot's life over the following years followed a pattern that, in hindsight, reads as a slow accumulation of evidence about exactly who he was. In 2010, 5 years after Holloway disappeared, he contacted her mother, Beth Holloway, and attempted to extort $250,000 from her, offering, in exchange for the money, to reveal the location of her daughter's remains, taking a $25,000 down payment with the rest promised once the remains were positively identified. That same year, while under FBI surveillance connected to the extortion attempt, van der Sloot traveled to Lima, Peru, met a 21-year-old Peruvian business student named Stephany Flores Ramirez at a casino, and murdered her in his hotel room. An act Peruvian prosecutors later argued was directly triggered by Flores discovering on his laptop information connecting him to the Holloway case on the exact anniversary of her disappearance. He was convicted of that murder in Peru in 2012 and sentenced to 28 years in prison, a sentence he has been serving in a Peruvian facility ever since. The case remained frozen in that state, a convicted murderer in Peru, still the presumed but legally unconfirmed killer of an American teenager on a different continent for over a decade. What finally broke the case open wasn't new physical evidence or a forensic breakthrough. It was the extortion charge itself, still outstanding. In the American legal system from 2010, that gave U.S. federal prosecutors in Alabama an actual legal hook to bring van der Sloot back into an American courtroom. In 2023, he was temporarily extradited from Peru to Birmingham, Alabama, specifically to face federal charges of extortion and wire fraud connected to that quarter. $1 million scheme against Holloway's mother. As part of a negotiated plea agreement, one that FBI officials say was worked out carefully with Beth Holloway's direct input and approval before it was finalized, van der Sloot agreed to sit for a formal recorded interview, known legally as a proffer session, in which he would tell the full truth about what happened to Natalee Holloway in exchange for the terms of his plea deal. That interview took place on October 3rd, 2023, and the transcript, later made public through court filings, is what finally definitively answered the question that had haunted the case for 18 years. According to that transcript, van der Sloot described leaving the bar with Holloway and walking with her to the beach, where the two of them began kissing. When he attempted to escalate things sexually and she refused and physically resisted him, he described becoming enraged, kicking her hard in the face, then spotting a cinder block nearby on the sand and using it to strike her, causing catastrophic injury. He described realizing, in the aftermath, that she was either dead or unconscious, and then, rather than seeking help, walking her body into the ocean and pushing it out into the water before returning home alone. It is, in every sense, exactly the horrifying ending. The case's most persistent fears had always pointed toward, confirmed finally in the killer's own words, nearly 2 decades after the fact. Beth Holloway was present in court when the plea was formally accepted, and has spoken publicly since about what hearing that confession meant to her. She has described it not as the kind of clean, satisfying closure people often imagine coming at the end of a case like this, but as something closer to the end of an unbearable, unresolved nightmare that had defined nearly 2 decades of her life. an ending that at least finally replaced endless uncertainty with a known, if devastating, truth. She has also said publicly that she believes the account Vander Sloot gave was corroborated by details investigators were able to independently verify, which matters. Because a confession alone, especially one negotiated as part of a plea deal, doesn't automatically settle every remaining question about reliability on its own. Here's the part of this story that tends to get lost in headlines announcing the case as simply solved, and it's important context for understanding exactly what did and didn't happen in that Alabama courtroom. Vander Sloot's 2023 guilty plea and prison sentence were for the extortion and wire fraud charges. The reason there was no separate American murder charge brought over the Holloway killing itself is straightforward and, for many people following the case, genuinely frustrating. Natalee Holloway was killed in Aruba, a Caribbean territory of the Kingdom of the Netherlands with its own independent legal system, and under Aruban law, the statute of limitations for prosecuting the underlying killing had already expired by the time Vander Sloot gave his 2023 confession. The United States has no jurisdiction to prosecute a killing that occurred entirely on foreign soil, and Aruba's own legal window to pursue a murder charge had closed. The confession answered conclusively, and in Vander Sloot's own words, the question that had tormented the Holloway family and the public for 18 years. It did not, and legally could not, produce an actual murder conviction for that specific killing. Vander Sloot has never been convicted of murdering Natalee Holloway. He has only ever confessed to it as part of a deal to resolve an entirely separate crime committed against her mother years later. That distinction, a confirmed truth without a matching legal conviction, is an uncomfortable but accurate way to describe where this case actually landed. There's one more chapter to this story, more recent than the confession itself, worth including for anyone following the case closely. In December 2025, according to reporting citing Peruvian outlet La Repubblica, Vander Sloot, now in his late 30s and still serving his sentence in a Peruvian prison for the murder of Stephany Flores, was found in critical condition after an apparent suicide attempt discovered with a sheet tied around his neck. Details about his current condition and the circumstances leading up to that incident remain limited in public reporting, and it isn't something this video can responsibly speculate further on beyond what's been confirmed. It is, at minimum, a reminder that even with the Holloway case now resolved in the sense that matters most to the family who spent 18 years fighting for an answer, the broader story around the man at the center of it isn't necessarily finished either. What makes this case worth understanding in full, rather than just as a headline about a confession, is how clearly it illustrates the gap that can exist between knowing the truth and achieving formal justice. For 18 years, investigators, journalists, and the Holloway family operated in a space of near certainty without proof. Yet to everyone privately convinced of who was responsible, without the legal system ever being able to act on that conviction because a body was never recovered and a confession never came. When the confession finally did arrive, it didn't come through forensic science or a breakthrough in cold case technology. It came through an entirely separate crime, an extortion scheme Vander Sloot himself chose to run against a grieving mother more than a decade after the original killing, that happened to give American prosecutors a legal opening they otherwise would never have had. And even then, the resulting justice was partial by design. Or a murder confession folded into an unrelated fraud sentence, running alongside an existing prison term for a second murder committed years after the first, because the actual killing itself had, by the time the truth finally surfaced, slipped outside the reach of the legal system that might otherwise have prosecuted it directly. Beth Holloway has spent nearly 20 years as one of the most visible and persistent advocates in American true crime history, refusing to let her daughter's case fade from public attention, and by every account, continuing that advocacy work, even after finally getting the answer she spent 2 decades demanding. Natalee Holloway's disappearance reshaped how a lot of American families think about international travel safety for young people, influenced legislation aimed at improving cooperation between American and foreign law enforcement in missing persons cases involving U.S. citizens abroad, and became, for better or worse, one of the defining true crime stories of the 2000s, playing out in real time across cable news in a way that arguably helped establish the entire modern true crime media genre that followed it. The truth, when it finally came, was exactly as horrifying as the worst version of the story the public had feared for 18 years. What's harder to sit with is that the truth arriving didn't come with the kind of clean legal ending most people assume a solved case is supposed to have. It came with a confession, a partial sentence tied to an unrelated crime, and a mother left to describe the result not as closure in the traditional sense, but simply as the end of not knowing, which, after 18 years, was the most complete version of justice this particular case was ever going to be able to deliver. Connected to his scheme against Beth Holloway, not for Natalee Holloway's murder itself. He received a 20-year sentence for the extortion case, which is being served concurrently, meaning at the same time as, not in addition to, his existing 28-year Peruvian sentence for killing Stephany Flores.